like this pay kind of things, no?
Okay.
Paytm.
Yeah. Right.
These
Right.
all guys, they always came as small these things, but they
Sir,
are
sir, I'll interrupt here, sir.
pay.
Yeah. Should start. Okay. Yeah.
Sir,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
is already 3:30, so we
Yes.
can
Yes.
start
Yes.
probably.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, Hello, everybody. Today we are going to have a very interesting research seminar on voice-led revival in of Indian manufacturing, and it is unemployment is a serious challenge before the country like India, and it is all presumed, argued, debated that industry in general and manufacturing sector in particular has the potential to kind of meet that challenge. There is another argument also there, that manufacturing sector we has the likelihood to generate decent employment. But of late, what we have seen that there is a increasing informalization of the contract worker. As we are going to discuss on that, maybe we'll get to know more about that informalization of contract worker in formal sector. So that is also very rampant. In this context, how can we enable and how can we ensure that manufacturing will generate decent employment? That is a really a monumental task. In this context, we have a very interesting, topic that we are going to discuss today, and I will have the privilege to introduce the speaker. We have with us Professor Joan Jess Thomas, who is currently a professor at IIT Delhi. He was also a former member of Kerala State Planning Board. Professor Joan Jose Thomas has finished his PhD from ISID Mumbai. He also holds a bachelor degree in industrial engineering from Kerala University. And his work basically dealt with various aspects of Indian development, especially issues related to labor, industrialization, and the macroeconomics. He teaches courses on macroeconomics, Indian economic development, international economics, and planning and development at IIT Delhi. His scholarly works have been published both in national and international journals through such as Economic Political Weekly, Indian Journal Labor Economics, World Development, Development and Change, and so on. With this word, I would like to also discuss, introduce the distinguished panelists to the viewer. And we have with us Professor M. Vijay Bhaskar. He's a professor at Madras Institute of Development Study, Chennai. He has a PhD from Center for Development Study, Trivandrum, which is affiliated to Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. His area of research basically political economy of regional development, agrarian and rural change, rural urban interaction, industrialization, and value chain and labor process. He has published several articles in EPW, Indian Journal of Labor Economics, Journal of Agrarian Change, and other reputed journals in India. In addition, he has edited and co-edited several books. His recent co-edited book is Rethinking Social Justice, which he co-authored with Anandi, Karthik, Ram, Manoharan, and A. Kalaiarasan. We also have Professor K. S. Hari with us, whom I know, I think from last, I think 15 year. He was our super senior at ICDS. So I have very, a good, I heard so much thing about him from CDS only. And Hari teaches 4 courses of public economics and development economics and political economy of India's development at the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, Pune, Maharashtra. His research areas are in development economics and specifically labor and employment in India, skilling, human development and economic growth, and also financing human development and regional economic development. He has published several articles in EPW, Indian Journal of Labor Economics, and other reputed journals. And also, finally, we have with us our my colleague Dr. Sangeeta Ghosh, who is an assistant professor here at ISID. He also works closely, in the area related to the today topic. He basically works on political economy of development, industrialization, regional development, informal economy, and issue related to labor and employment. He has published prior to joining ISID, she worked as an assistant editor in EPW Mumbai. She has published some published hot research in reputed journal EPW like EPW1, Review of Development Change, and so on. With this word, I don't want to delay further. Without much ado, I would like to invite Professor Jain to start his presentation. And the presentation will be in the following manner. You'll be getting something around roughly around 25 to 30 minutes. Then each panelist will get 10 minutes, and the rest of the time we will have for the discussion. With that, please continue. Mr. Jain.
Thank you, Sanjay. And good afternoon to you all. Can I share my PowerPoint? I think perhaps you may have to grant me access.
Dhananjay will do that.
Can you make me a presenter or something?
Dhananjay will help, I think.
So you can share, sir. It's enabled. Sharing.
All participants can share.
Yeah.
Yeah, all can share.
Start share.
It is in the down panel.
Okay.
Oh, there an upward arrow is there.
Green,
Yeah,
forever.
I saw that. Okay, grant access.
So there is a green arrow. You can just click on that. I think from there, I think you can.
Yeah.
At the bottom row. Yeah.
I'll just try again.
Then I
Yeah.
just tried that and I could. Oh,
Yeah, is it coming? Yeah.
Yeah, it has come.
Is it the full screen?
No.
Not yet.
Yeah,
is it the full screen? Yeah.
Yeah, now
Yeah,
it
just,
is.
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you so much for this. Thank you so much for the invitation, Bina, other colleagues of ISID, and thank you all the discussants. I mean, they're all very old friends, long-time friends, not old, long, people I know and people I know for a long time, and people who I respect their work, I respect a lot. So it's a great meeting you all. So I think I would like to speak about a possibility of a wage-led revival of Indian manufacturing. We all know, I think most of us in this meeting know that one of the problems of Indian development is the relatively small size, both in terms of the share of manufacturing in terms of value added or GDP, as well as in terms of employment. You can see the share of Indian manufacturing never ever crossing more than 18%. Whereas if you look at China or South Korea, their peak manufacturing shares in GDP was something like 30%. And if anything, in the last few years, there's been a lot of initiatives to revive manufacturing. But if you look at the graph here, it actually says our manufacturing share in GDP has been declining from around 15% to now latest is 13%. Whereas you see countries like Vietnam increasing their manufacturing shares in GDP. When it comes to labor absorption, the picture is even more dismal. The size of manufacturing employment has not been growing. Of course, the latest PLFS survey show an improvement. We can talk about it later. But broadly, this is what we see. The red is industry, which includes manufacturing, electricity, and so on. Even when there has been some improvement in the value added, the left side is shares in India's GDP or value added. The industries share slight increase over the years from 83 to 2023. That's a 40-year period. Whereas if you look at the employment share is kind of stuck at where it is, something around 11 to 14%. So this is a big problem for India's development, employment generation. We all know this. Now, what are the arguments? What are the reasons attributed to India, the standard growth of manufacturing in India? We know the more influential argument is possibly what may be called coming from the mainstream economic theory, which points to the supply constraints, supply of land, and supply of labor. And we know the argument about labor market rigidity has been quite influential both in the academic as well as in the policy circles. The main point is that after 1976, the tightening of the labor regulations, some of the larger firms have to obtain government permissions to close the factories, which is the reason why India's organized manufacturing is experiencing a jobless growth. And it looks persuasive, the argument, if you look at this data, if you look at the period from 1980 to 2004-5, India's manufacturing employment, that is the factory employment, was stuck at around 8 million. There was no change in manufacturing factory employment, although output was increasing. So the argument was that this is because of the labor regulations. I think we need to spend a few minutes on what is the larger theoretical argument essentially coming from the mainstream, which is that it's a comparative advantage theory that a labor surplus country like India has a labor advantage in labor intensive industries. And the argument is getting relative prices right is the way forward for a country like India. And what do we mean by getting relative prices right? Getting relative prices right means if your labor is your advantage, your wages should remain low. Wages should remain at a low or stagnant. So which means any kind of government regulations in the form of minimum wage or factory acts or trade union interventions, they can all be counterproductive according to this mainstream argument. Now, but is that correct? If you look at the East Asian experience, because these are again countries, we all started at the same level in the 1950s and probably even until 1960. But you see now that some of the East Asian countries like South Korea have gone far ahead of India. Even China is significantly ahead of India in terms of growth. The question is, can we say cheap wages or low wages of workers? Was that the reason for East Asia's economic success? The answer is no. In fact, one of the important scholars on East Asian development is Alice Amsden, who worked on South Korea. What she says is East Asia developed not by getting relative prices right, as the mainstream economists argue, but actually by getting relative prices wrong. So it is not by wages remaining stagnant, wages increased, but it is actually by the government or the state intervening, the leading role of the state, the leading hand of the state. It can be in the form of subsidies, it can be in the form of identifying which industries to grow and so on and so forth, but it was never stagnant wages. As you can see here, as a proportion of the US wage, wages increased in all East Asian countries, starting with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China. China, of course, if you look at the latest data, I'm sure the Chinese wages as a share of the US wage would have increased much higher. So this argument that, what India need to do to revive manufacturing is to keep its wages low, which also means perhaps go easy on the labor laws. Perhaps I think we need to re-examine that. Of course, we also understand that India's planning was a clear example of getting relative prices wrong. A poor country, 2 centuries of colonialism, starting with very advanced industries of the time, be it space, be it, atomic energy, establishing the IITs. So it was a clear case of relative prices wrong. But I think at the same time, probably of course, there will be a criticism on that. On the one side, there's a big criticism on that. But the question is, what was something, I think we should also understand that probably one of the factors which slowed down Indian development was that a larger social and structural transformation of the society was not achieved, or even while we were very ambitious on the planning side. Social inequalities on the basis of caste and gender and other lines continued. We didn't have any large progressive social transformation, radical redistributive measures such as land reforms. And after 91, while we started with planning with great amount of state intervention in development, after 91, in fact, there was a complete retreat of the state from industrial development. So this is a context that we must understand. And we all know that in Indian industry, around 40%, no, I think more than 25%, is in the unregistered sector. So the one way to look at it, so because we have data from the PLFS, or the periodic labor force surveys, or earlier the national sample survey on employment and unemployment. So estimates based on that these are household based surveys that provide an estimate of the total manufacturing employment. So that is around 60 million. Now it has increased if you go by the latest two surveys. But then you also have a factory sector employment data coming from the annual survey of industry, which is a firm-based survey. So there is a bit of a problem in this comparison. One is a household-based survey, the other is a firm-based survey. But the firm-based factory survey actually shows around 16 million. So 16 out of 60 is only in the factory sector, which is the 10 plus firms. The rest are all very, very small industries, which are typically, this is a picture from Coimbatore. So, I think around 75% of India's manufacturing workers are in such small industrial units. Well, in fact, this provides a picture of the unregistered and factory employment in various industries. All these numbers are in lakhs. So you can see, for instance, textiles, garments, leather, footwear. So it's a very big component. So you have around more than 200 lakh, around 2 crore workers, more than 2 crore workers, but of which only 33 lakh are in the factories. The rest 200 lakh are in very small enterprises. But remember, this is also the largest industry or industrial cluster, both overall as well as even within the factories. So, I mean, some of the highly promising industry, like such as the auto industry, the motor vehicles, you have around 15 lakh workers in the factory sector and very small number of workers in the unregistered sector. So I think it's important to look at some of the industries which are probably very important in terms of value addition, but they are in terms of employment creation, they are not really big. A recent addition in terms of employment, a recent industry which has grown very well, and much of it again in the unregistered sector, is furniture, jewelry, toys, precision equipment, and so on. Now it's again, this graph is again, I would like all of you to take a closer look at this. We mentioned at the beginning that we had a problem in terms of growth of factory employment. India's factory employment remains stagnant at around 8 million for almost 2 decades, 1980s to 2004, early 1980s to early 2000s. But after 2000s, after 2005, 2004, you have a relatively fast growth of factory employment, which is what you see here. 8 becomes 13, 15, as again, I'm sure most of you know, but just to make it things clear, factory employment, this blue line, what you see is employment in factories which employ more than 10 workers with electric power. But you also see that the biggest chunk of employment, as we just mentioned, is in the unregistered sector. And while the factory sector was not growing, the unregistered sector was growing. The 80s, 90s, there was fast growth of the unregistered sector. So you had it was around 30, it actually increased to 55 million. But from around 2011, you find the unregistered sector not growing fast enough. So it's kind of a stagnant employment in the unregistered sector between 2011 to 2018, 2019. Although, yes, as I said, the latest data show an improvement. I will not go into the detail. If there is time, we can come back to it. Now, but one thing is what we see here is an overall stagnation in manufacturing employment. At the same time, an expansion in the factory sector. But remember that factory sector expansion in employment has occurred along with some amount of informalization of the factory employment, which is that more and more of the workers are contract workers, and that's what you see in this graph. And part of the reason is what I already started at the beginning, that the social inequalities in India continue to play a role. If you look, many of the large factories in India now employ migrant workers on a contract basis, of course, paying extremely low wages. We did a study from IIT Delhi. We found, for instance, that in Ludhiana, workers have to work for around 12 hours to get rupees 500. 12 hours of work, and most, when orders are high, almost every single day of the week you work. And the reason we found from our study is that most of these migrants are mostly men, young or middle-aged, and they suffer from multiple disadvantages. And in fact, this is clearly a problem of our long-term development. They belong to social groups that face social that are socially disadvantaged. Many of the workers belong to scheduled caste. They do not own land or other assets in the village where they come from. They do not receive any form of social security in the villages they come from. The education levels, the skill levels are clearly very poor. They don't have any social security also in the place they work, which was very clearly seen during the COVID time when workers left. So every day you have to work, otherwise you will not be able to sustain yourself in the place where you work. And what you see, I hope you can see this graph in clear, especially the last part, which is more important. You can see profits as a share of value added in India's factory sector has been rising. Of course, it was rising during a period of boom, then kind of slowed down. But look at what has happened immediately after the COVID period. COVID ended. You see a big increase in profits as a share of value added and a fall in. So in fact, these are as profit as a share of value added increase typically occurs when wages as a share of value added decline. So you see a mirror image is a decline in wages as a share of value added. So in fact, post-COVID, there's been an increase in working hours, although wages did not increase or payments did not increase. So essentially what I want to say is that it's not low wage. It's not, the typical argument that you do not have enough flexibility in the labor market. You are not actually, or the argument that you are not able to fire workers as and when you want, or the wages are probably high. So that argument clearly doesn't work in India. In fact, our wages are quite low. We have to look at other reasons why Indian industry is not growing. We have to look at industrial policy, but clearly the very first important fact is our investments have slowed down, especially after 2008, which is what you see here. Look at the red line, which is for India, and the blue line, which is for China. 2008, India and China were at similar levels of investment, around 40% of GDP. The post-crisis, the financial crisis of 2008, China's investment increased, and much of it coming from the public sector, state-owned enterprises, much of it in new technologies, including artificial intelligence, the result of which we saw 2-3 days back. Whereas India just went the opposite direction. You can see this graph. India's investment rates falling, and it continued to fall. From 40% to 30% from 38% by 2011, coming to around 30% by 2015, and continue to fall. So investment is the prime driver for any economy, for both for demand and for supply. On the supply side, of course, we know infrastructure has been quite poor. we have been doing field work in Coimbatore over the last, from 2007 onwards. I've been visiting Coimbatore, and for a long time, between 2007 and 2013, power shortages was a very big problem in Coimbatore. But not just power shortages, poor road transport, port facilities, all these increase firms' cost and competitive disadvantages. You can see the power shutdown schedule in one pump manufacturer. How can any manufacturer, especially if it's many of these manufacturing operations require continuous operations, like furnace requires continuous operation. So when you have power cuts continuously, frequently, you certainly cannot, it's going to be a big disadvantage. The other is, of course, credit. When it comes to especially micro and small industries, you look at the red line, the share of the total bank credit going to micro and small industries was around 15% in 1990. It came down to around 6% by the early 2000s, less than 5% now. The latest, this is, of course, I do not have the very latest, but it was kind of coming down. So, many micro enterprises, and I've seen this across in small enterprises across India. When you visit these small enterprises across India, whether it's in Coimbatore, whether it's in Rajkot, one of the main things they say, and I'm sure Bhaskar will be able to say more, that many of them depend on personal or family savings, and working capital is a particularly difficult thing, especially during slowdowns. And there's also a growing gap between the organized and the unorganized, and which you can see very clearly from this graph, where your imports from outside of in many industries are growing, which means that the scope for many of these ancillary products to be produced in India comes down. If you're importing the parts required for a power equipment manufacturing, then it's actually reducing the scope for many small units in India to produce those industries. Sorry, also foreign exchange fluctuations. I don't want to come back. I can speak about it later if there is time. But I just want to end, end this part, not fully end. I just need another. I hope I will get another 5 more minutes, perhaps, Sanjay.
Yeah, please.
So yeah, probably. Yeah. So I just want to say, clearly, if you look at the reasons for India's slow growth in Indian manufacturing, beginning with investment rate not fast enough, our policies, especially for the small industries, and it is not labor. Labor is certainly not the reason why manufacturing is not growing. And a very good example is the garment industry. This is a recent work, one of my colleagues, Chinju, who did PhD at IIT Delhi here, and I jointly wrote a paper in the EPW. So the garment is an industry where one would think India has the best advantage. It's a labor-intensive industry. According to comparative advantage, India has a real advantage in this industry. But if you look at the garment industry's share in exports, India's share in worldwide exports in the garment industry has remained stagnant around 3%. China, of course, has been very high, around 31%. But the surprising changes have happened from Bangladesh and Vietnam. You can look at the graph here, how after 2005 these two countries increased their share in global export of garments. So this is a low wage industry, and this is a country where we have very number of workers, especially workers willing to work at low wages. The reason why it is not growing in what we found is that the industry in India, although it's again a labor intensive industry, it's still operating in very small factories, very traditional nature of small and fragmented nature of operation. If it has to modernize, of course, modernization involves some amount of investments in machinery, buildings, and providing slightly higher wages and providing more regular employment to the workers. Because if you want to export, you also have to maintain certain labor standards and certain quality standards and so on. but many of the Indian capitalists are actually not willing to go to that extent. For them, the limited advantages arising from the availability of cheap labor is kind of sufficient. I mean, they are successful in segments of the domestic market and also in some niche areas in the export market. So clearly, the availability of low wage labor is in a way a hindrance to modernization, in a way a hindrance to innovation. I mean, you don't really invest in technology, you don't really invest in modernization, because you tend to depend more and more on the cheapness of labor, of course, by paying lower wages, and which of course creates creates a larger social problem. But you can see the R&D percentage, R&D, research and development spending as percent of GDP. India's share at 0.65, much lower than China's, forget South Korea or the US. But the last point I want to make here, of course, is that low wages is in fact, by paying low wages, the industry is shooting, it on its own foot, in the sense that it's actually limiting its own future growth. Because, of course, one way to look at it is when you pay lower wages, your wage share is low, which means your profit share is high. But profit share is not enough. For an industry, what is important is profit rate, profit as a share of the capital that it has invested. Now, if the factories are not running because there is not enough demand in the economy, then your profit rate will come down. So low wages actually translate into low domestic demand, which actually means your factories will not be running at full capacity, which your capacity utilization is low, which will actually pull you down. So by paying low wages, actually, the Indian industry is pulling itself down. In fact, therefore, rising wages helps economic growth. It enlarges the size of the market and allows businesses to flourish. There is also another reason why, if you look around the world today, we know growing protectionism in the developed world. So if you look at this graph, exports as a share of GDP was very high for East Asia and China for a very long time. And definitely for India and South Asia, this was much lower. Now, for India or for other South Asian countries to expect that exports will be the driver of its future growth, as it had been for East Asia and China in the 90s, 80s, and 90s, that is going to be much tougher because of the protectionist policies that we see today. That is number one, but also the slowing growth of the Western economies because of aging population and so on and so forth. Which means that future growth have to depend on domestic incomes, which means the market is going to be here. The market cannot be abroad. Your export chances are much less. So you have to build your domestic market, and the only way to build your domestic market is to allow the wages to increase. So widening the sources of demand will raise the consumption of investment for the poor. And I think that can happen only with some amount of public investment. You cannot ask the businesses, especially the small businesses, to pay higher wages. What can happen is with public expenditures on health, education, housing, the real wages of workers can increase. I mean, if you look at in Ludhiana, the migrant workers we interviewed, monthly income of around 12,000, of which 3,000 is spent on rent, 1,000 on electricity, 2,000 on children's education. You can imagine what is left for the family, a family of 4 or 5. So much of this can be reduced. These expenditures can be reduced by the government subsidizing or providing free education and health. So I think I will end with this. What we need in India, we all know that we need a revival of our manufacturing, and that revival cannot happen with stagnant and low wages. That can happen only with rising wages. But industrial growth with rising wages is much more challenging than industrial growth with slow or even and with some degree of reliance on export market, because you have to upgrade your industrial structure very quickly, and you have to actually you move your competitiveness from cheap labor to innovation. But that can also happen only with some degree of upgrading of human resources, not just some degree. One has to do it very quickly, which also means we are going to see the budget tomorrow. Public expenditures on social sectors have to increase large. That's the only way to boost real wages. But we also require industrial policy and public spending on research and development, both for labor intensive and for knowledge based industries, and also for better regional spread of these industries. Thank you so much for this. I hope I am almost on time.
Thank you so much, Professor Joyan. It is a really interesting and insightful paper. I think that people might have learned a lot of things from your presentation. Now let's learn from the panelists how they reflect upon your paper. I would like to request Professor Vijay Bhaskar to give his inputs on your presentation.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, sir.
Yeah. Okay, I think there's some. One second. Yeah. So thank you, Professor Jain. Of course, thank you, Dr. Sanjay and Dr. Beena, for this invitation. I enjoyed listening to you, Jain, and also I also enjoyed reading your paper. So I think some aspects of the paper I think you have not kind of touched upon, particularly on the issues of inequality, right? And of course, you did mention the importance of industrial policy towards the end, but I thought your paper had a little bit more, to say on the rationale for industrial policy. So I think, I mean, as I understand, your paper is a very strong corrective to by emphasizing the demand side and emphasizing the distributional aspects of the growth, as opposed to an exclusive concern with growth rates, one, and then this entire obsession with ease of doing business, which essentially meant a supply side kind of a focus, and the kind of easing of regulations and so on, which you kind of alluded to. So yeah, I mean, I don't have any major kind of issues with it. I just thought I'll raise a few questions which are, in some sense tangential and helps us to think through some of these things more. So one the thing, I mean, I want to kind of substantiate your argument. You do talk about how manufacturing, employment did increase, in the period for immediate post 2000s till the economic crisis hit, and you kind of related to the improvement in investments, public investments, particularly in rural India, right? To talk about NREGA and also other kinds of investments, which led to revival in rural incomes, and as a result of which demand increased, contributing to improvement in manufacturing growth, including manufacturing employment. Now, I mean, it's definitely yes, but then I thought probably you can establish that better by looking at decomposing the sources of growth in manufacturing by looking at the sectors. When you think you already have a sectoral analysis of the various within manufacturing. So I was wondering that if we can just look at the kind of sectors which are likely to have responded to these improvements in rural incomes, then kind of make a case for that. I thought that would probably strengthen the paper. But having said that, you also kind of attribute the subsequent slump in manufacturing employment, particularly in the organized sector, to a compression in rural demand, right? Now, that is something, I thought I'll just probably kind of ask you something about that. How do we explain this compression in rural demand? I mean, we do know that MGNREGA, for example, obviously there was, to begin with, there was not much political support for that. But then because of popular pressure, because of electoral pressure, they could not roll back the MGNREGA as much as they would have otherwise liked to, right? So there is a bureaucratic repression of demand on this site. I'm not denying that, but it's not as much as that would warrant which would lead to a slump in overall kind of demand, leading to a decline in manufacturing employment. And also, if we take into account the fact that there are other kinds of transfers and welfare transfers to rural areas. I'm thinking of PM Kisan scheme, which transfers 6,000 rupees annually to farmers. Then you also have a number of state level initiatives, which are basically targeted at, transfers to rural households. So given that, is it possible to attribute the slump in manufacturing employment to a collapse in rural demand? That is something, particularly after 2011-12. That is something, which is not very clear. But having said that, the other aspect, which I thought was particularly, at least to me, is particularly more important, which affects rural demand, is something which you started with earlier, which is the inability to effect structural transformation. Yeah. So here, of course, people have always spoken about a tortuous transition or a stunted transformation, but now we have reached a point where scholars like Santosh Mehrotra and K. Nagaraj, they're talking to process of reverse of structural transformation. In fact, the share of employment in agriculture has actually increased now. So when you talk about the demand, actually pushing the growth, manufacturing growth, pushing down manufacturing growth, to me, probably this inability to, affect agrarian transition, seems to be a much more important factor, the demand side, which will affect the demand side more than this kind of reversals or, rural welfare transfers. This is something, which I thought that I'd like to kind of listen in a bit more from you on this. On a related note, again, you also speak about a stagnation for formal employment and then an increase in informal manufacturing employment. But towards the end, you speak about, and also you point out rather, an increase in the share in formal manufacturing employment as well, which you kind of allude to the relaxation of labor laws and so on, which though on paper, they're formally employed, but the conditions are not decent in any sense of the term. They may just have a contract, but they can be fired anytime the employer wants them to, and so on. But what was the other point that you make about this reason for a large share of manufacturing employment being confined to the informal economy is the nature of demand. Again, you speak about how low income demand, essentially, which is about cheap, low quality goods, essentially can be produced in the informal enterprises. So my concern, my question here is, now if we assume that increase in rural demand has been kind of pushing for increase in rural employment, then shouldn't we be anticipating more of the informal employment kind, rather than informal enterprises growth kind, rather than the other way around? And the point you make about the components, which I think is very, very interesting, say that increasingly components are being imported. Imports as a share of manufacturing has increased, which essentially means that the linkages that manufacturing can potentially develop with small firms, ancillary firms, are actually been muted because of this increase in imports. I think that's a very important point. I think it's definitely worth developing on. I'd like to kind of see more, on that, not now, but at some point in time later. The other thing, again, is about your emphasis on industrial policy. Well, you spoke as an inequality, but I think I'll just let it be. I think it's more or less kind of understood, so I'll just not deal at length. So on this industrial policy, one thing that struck me, in fact, since you mentioned a lot about the garment sector, I just wanted to recollect an instance, of a conversation which I had with an exporter in Tirupur, because I was telling him about this need to kind of improve manufacturing employment and so on. And he immediately retorted saying that, he asked me, why on earth do you want me to kind of, generate manufacturing employment? Because he says The same amount of money, had I been wiser, I would have put in real estate, and 10 years later, I would have actually earned twice or thrice the amount of money that I would have made through rent, rather than uh, get into this dirty pitch. He called it the dirty business of manufacturing, which and so it's a huge headache, not only in terms of meeting deadlines, quality standards, and also kind of managing labor and then making sure that they kind of deliver on time and so on. So this incentive structure, where often you spoke about how Ludhiana, there is no incentive for them to modernize, apart from the fact that that they're not having enough incentive because of poor demand. I think the other important thing is uh, there is strong incentive for them to invest somewhere else where the returns are higher. You see, I think that seems to be another important point, which is what is contributing to it, because the returns in manufacturing compared to some of the other more attractive rent-thick sectors, I think that's another important factor we might want to kind of keep in mind. And coming to industrial policy, yes, I mean wage-led manufacturing is absolutely kind of necessary. But here again, when you think of industrial policy in broad sense of the term, of course, we do have, even here, even at present, it's not explicitly stated. You have all kinds of incentives. You also have kind of protections kind of being erected. But the other important point, which especially in the post-independence planning, there's a lot of discussion on, is the kind of industries we want, the kind of balance between sectors, or within industrial sector, as about the balance between, say, capital goods sector and the consumer goods sector, the balance between manufacturing and services, and the need to kind of effectively, undertake effective structural transformation. So these are also part of industrial policy, which, for some reason, which is not being adequately kind of engaged with. So I think emphasis on that would be kind of useful. So I'll just stop now, Dr. Sanjay, and probably come again if required later. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for
Yeah,
your feedbacks on the presentation of Professor Jain. I would like to invite Professor K.S. Hari for his feedbacks on the presentation.
Hi, Sanjay. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're very much
Yeah,
audible.
thank you for this opportunity, and I am really thankful to Jayan for a detailed comment or the analysis on the Indian industry, which we have been hearing for a very long time as student of economics in various forums. And this whole thing, I appreciate Jayan for bringing in the whole macroeconomic idea from some micro level studies which he has done in some case studies in Ludhiana, Coimbatore and all, and how to draw inference for the larger case of industrialization in India. I do appreciate that, but I was expecting a little bit more in terms of the macroeconomic modeling, in sense that how this all wage demand is going to be generated. I would like to carry from where Professor Bhaskar has discussed about the whole question of linking this aggregate consumer demand. Or if one can try with, say, some kind of a, because recently we have 2 rounds of NSSO rounds of consumption expenditure is available. So if we can say disaggregate that and kind of link with the kind of industrialization that is, or what kind of changes that has happened in the consumption expenditure across different deciles or across different groups, and how that demand is changing over the last 1 decade, say from 2011 to 2000, say 22-23, or the recent 23-24 which was released. Then I think we will get more inference into the kind of changes that has happened in the demand structure of the economy, because that will give more impetus to the way demand is getting generated in the economy. And then comes the question of wages also. So wages also, whether what changes has happened in the wage level, because we all know that there is a more or less a kind of a stagnancy in the real wages over a period of time in the, that is what I read because of the kind of inflation that has been there in the Indian economy over a period of time, whatever nominal increases that has happened over a period of time, that does not get reflected into the kind of real wages in the economy. So I was expecting some kind of this kind of a reflection which link with the kind of changes that has happened. So that should have added more, I think, value into the argument which Jayan has been making into this kind of an analysis. And then we can talk about the earlier, say, Mihir Rakshid and others were talking in the 80s and 90s about the kind of problems with the demand side in Indian industry. So then I think there will be a perfect match in the absence of the kind of external market, means in the absence of an export market, especially in the kind of commodities or the goods which he has been mentioning in terms of textiles or garment industry to per se. So there comes another question. I feel that when you talk about the garment industry where Indonesia or Bangladesh has a competitive advantage, where I recently read some literature, maybe Jayan can reflect upon that, these countries had a advantage in terms of they have some trade agreements with EU, European Union, which facilitate them. But on the other hand, India is not having any, because we are negotiating for some kind of trade agreement in terms of these textiles and garments. But that may be a general agreement which may be disadvantage for some other commodities where we have a comparative disadvantage. So because it is going to be a two-way relationship when you have a trade agreement. So such cases, I feel that rather than labor, other standards become a hindrance for India. Just like Bhaskar was talking about the standard, EU standards in terms of other non-tariff barriers, how that has affected the Indian, even the small scale industry or medium small scale industry in terms of capturing the export market. So that also in a way has curtailed. So I feel that when you talk about a policy paradigm, so we have to bring into all these dimensions. Even if it is in a domestic market as a user, as an end user, I do also expect a better quality product that is coming from the Indian manufacturing once my level of income increases. So in a way, we also, because we have kept historically our standards, quality standards low. So in a way that is done to a situation where we are not able to compete in the global market also. So how this paradox can be resolved is going to be a question. Another is with regard to the kind of this labor market regulation which Dr. Jayan has been talking about. I am sure Professor Goldar has come up with an article recently in EPW with regard to a few states, 5 states he has analyzed with regard to the labor market flexibility or the kind of changes that is means that again is opening up a kind of a debate, because some other studies like say Goswami and Paul, Chowdhury and Sharma, these are the earlier studies in 2002, 22, 21. All these studies were giving another picture, but Professor Goldar has come up with an alternative argument in terms of the kind of effect that labor market flexibility had upon the absorption or the labor absorption in the Indian manufacturing sector as well as Indian industry in general. So I think that may be another thing which maybe some of those things we can also reflect upon. And coming to this PLFS data, means I think we have to take those data with a little bit of pinch of salt, in the sense that 2 years specifically, if you look at the 2017-18 and 18-19, I think that this demonetization and GST had an impact upon those 2 years, especially when you talk about the informal or the unorganized sector in toto, as well as basically that were the period there was a slump. If you look at that graph, you can see there is a decline in the unorganized sector employment as well as the value added or the value of output. there is a slump in those 2 years. So I think that has to be reflected upon specifically to those two incidences. I think so. Once one use the PLFS data for comparison, I think we have to be a little bit more careful. And the larger question which Jayan, of course, has been raising about the quality in terms of education, the need for public intervention into, or the role of public sector. So all these things, I think we all do agree with. Means generally there is a consensus that these all are important issues. And for discussion, I would like to add one more point, is that since he has been referring to the East Asian countries also. So when you look at the industrialization in East Asian countries, they were selecting certain commodity groups or commodities, and they were specifically focusing on that. So if I do believe, if we have 29 states, at least state specific, if we can have an industrial policy in in liaison with the union government, if you can have a kind of a state specific focus on certain goods or certain commodities where the states have a comparative advantage. So I think long term that kind of a policy framework will do better, because now we are hitting on all without reaching. That has been our experience for so many years, that we are trying all sorts of permutations and combination. So if I think that if we can be state specific in terms of choosing certain specific industries which can be either labor intensive or per se, because now we can, labor intensive needs to be clearly defined also in the modern terms, but at least in terms of high technology intensive industries also, if you want to focus on certain sectors or certain regions, that needs to come up formally. I think now it is a time to have a policy framework which is going to be very specific region wise also, so that I think more focus can be here. So I will stop here with this, and yeah, thank you once again.
Thank you so much, sir, for your feedback. I think that would definitely enrich Professor Jayan's paper. Now I will request my colleague, Dr. Sangeeta Ghosh, to make her remarks.
Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you, Jayan. Thank you, Professor Jayan, for your presentation. Also, thank you, Professor Vijay Bhaskar and Professor Hari, for the issues that you have brought to this discussion as well. I mean, both of you have already laid out a lot of issues that are there to be discussed. So I might be repetitive in some ways, you know. So frankly, I think the book chapter and your presentation, Jayan, is extremely relevant in talking about the often neglected subject of demand-led growth and the role that workers' wages more specifically play in that. It is a good reminder to think that the East Asian countries that grew did not grow by depressing or stagnating their wages, but rather an improvement in the wages in these countries had led a path for the rapid industrial development that we see there. And yes, as Professor Hari mentioned, a focused industrial policy that really meant business. I felt, you know, the chapter was, it had lots of insights for ideas and very holistic in the way that it dealt with the demand side issues that persist in stalling the growth in the manufacturing sector. And you've captured the historical failures after independence, and you know, since then, that did very little to address the deep roots of poverty and inequality in India, which, as you point out, countries like Japan and China addressed very early in their economic journey to bring about an egalitarian social structure, which is very important as a demand base to create well-being and prosperity in their economies. You have mentioned how, in the Indian context, measures such as land redistribution or land reforms and investments in basic education and health and ownership of assets by marginal sections of the society, the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, were not paid attention to. And these dimensions, of course, played out in the labor market as well to ensure that the well-paying jobs went to the privileged classes and created more inequality, and the marginalized communities and vulnerable groups were caught up in low productivity and low-paying jobs. Social discrimination on the basis of caste plays out in the labor market outcomes as well. something constitutional rights and directives towards abolition of the caste systems failed to obliterate so fast. In fact, here I'd like to mention a very recent book by Professor Thorat and Madheshwaran and B.P. Vani on the discrimination in the labor market that shows the enormous impact discrimination has had on the capacity of the marginalized to be lifted out of poverty. So through a decomposition exercise, they basically show that in 1718, nearly a 73% gap in employment and about 43% gap in wages between the scheduled caste and higher caste among the regular salaried wage workers were on the basis of caste discrimination. So after accounting for the wage and employment losses due to discrimination in total consumption expenditure, what they show is that the incidence of poverty would have declined by 7.1 percentage points during 2004 and 5 and 9.2 percentage points during 1718 for the scheduled castes, which implies that nearly 0.8 million and 1.6 million scheduled caste regular salaried workers in those two respective years could have been lifted out of poverty in the absence of caste discrimination. So, of course, this also has a huge impact on the outcomes in the labor market that affect the demand conditions in the country. Another issue, or rather trend, that your work brings out is the decline in the employment figures in the unorganized manufacturing sector and the increase in employment in the organized manufacturing sector in the more recent years. While much of the organized sector employment, of course, has been on the account of contract workers, that shows a trend towards the increased informalization of the more protected formal sector. The fall in the employment in the unorganized manufacturing sector, however, is very big. So what the numbers show us is that between 11-12 and 17-18, 2017-18, the organized employment increased by 2.1 million. However, the total manufacturing employment fell by 2.5 million, which means that the unorganized sector lost 4.5 million jobs by the official statistics. Now, as Professor Vijay Bhaskar pointed out, whether this is related to schemes like MGNREGA that boost rural income remains to be established, and it is surely a possibility. I think trends in consumption patterns in this period, as Professor Hari pointed out as well, would shed light on whether this helped or not, or whether it was just a case of gradual decline of the unorganized sector and what various economic policies in that period and how they might have impacted this. I mean, I do remember from my own fieldwork on the informal sector in Surat, Tirupur and other areas at that, Mumbai, Delhi at that point of time, in 2017, right after demonetization and the implementation of GST, and it showed the distress that was quite unrelated to the support system that can be created by employment guarantee schemes. But of course, more work needs to be done on this to really establish this, And so far, of course, data had been a constraint, but now, of course, some of that period can be looked at. And I think it's very important what Professor Hari pointed out, that the last 2 years of the PLFS data has had these changes in the definition of self-employment. That has so self-employment now includes categories of work which were considered out of the labor force before. So people who collect firewood for domestic use or for sale, etc. Those kinds of categories are now included as self-employment. And it has been actually pointed out in a few articles on the Indian Forum. So I think it's something to be considered while looking at those last periods of data from the PLFS survey and comparing them to the earlier periods, Also, Professor Jain, of course, you've listed the factors that play a role in not providing the much needed support. And I think it's particularly true for the small businesses, like constraints of infrastructure, the high cost of power, lack of power generation in some places, that erodes competitiveness, the underdeveloped roads and connectivity to ports, credit constraints, particularly again for small enterprises where lack of documentation and collaterals disallow them to access formal credit from banks. The rising import intensities, as you've pointed out in various sectors, that also, destabilizes the link between the small and the big in the manufacturing sector. I think it's also like a very important point of discussion that Professor Thomas raises, the need to grow by domestic demand. While, often in our policies and conversations, the way out is often this export orientation. But I think the focus really has to be the domestic market. And particularly in these times of great uncertainty in the global economy and the state of the world economy in general. So India should really bank and concentrate on its large domestic market. that it has at its command, and the marginally propensity to consume, of course, is much higher in the lower quartiles of the income distribution. And this is also where employment, a rise in wages, provision of social security need to be directed. State support, of course, as Jayan mentions, is crucial for to subsidize living in general in terms of houses, education, health, food. And with this state support, then, the wages can have a command to buy things, raise purchasing power, boost demand for manufactured goods. So industrial policy needs to focus on labor-intensive sectors as well, sectors that have greater employment elasticity, such as the textile and garment sector, and also on mitigating the challenges that small businesses face. So the focus really has to be on the small and more vulnerable informal labor force to boost, the wages there, the social security there, to have the possibility of a demand-led growth. Yeah, also, as I, really mentioned that Professor Jain's presentation and chapter have a lot of insights for future research that can be pursued to have a more in-depth study on wages and demand-led growth in general, and as well as the aspects of industrial policy, more finely, more granularly that need to be pursued. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sangeeta, for your insightful feedback on the presentation of Professor Jain Thomas. I would like to request Professor Jain to respond to the comments and feedback if you wish to, please.
Thank you, Sanjay, and thank you very much for all the three discussions by Bhaskar, Hari, and Sangeeta. I think I'll probably, put all the comments together rather than responding to each one by one. Perhaps there were a few sets of comments which came from the three discussions. One is on the demand question, and Bhaskar's question as to why is, is it right that there is, is there a demand shortage because there are more transfers now? I think that is true. On this one side, there are more transfers. MNREGA is there, and the subsidized food program has come up. But I think that may not compensate for the stagnation in employment. And of course, we know the PLFS data is certainly not perfect, but the good thing now is we have now PLFS data coming almost on an annual basis, which also help us to track what is happening in each year, not just in terms of the employment numbers, but also the wage rates. So Hari was also asking about the wage rates. So, and I think if you go into more disaggregated picture of what is happening with employment, we should be able to understand, no? I mean, self-employment, if you kind of exclude women's self-employment, we should be able to kind of understand what is probably really happening with the economy. So now if you look at it in terms of employment growth, employment that is considered, because we must understand on the one side, we have a growing young population, and it's a limited demographic window of opportunity, growing for another 10 or 20 years. But after which our population is actually going to age population. So this is, in fact, we are actually going through the best phase. The potential for economic growth is the highest now in India. Starting from around 2000 to 2020 is actually the best phase of in terms of our demographic structure. So it's not just, so when our employment opportunities are not growing fast enough, manufacturing we saw is somewhat stagnant, and the increase in recent years has largely been in the less where wages are low, such as garment is one of the sectors where growth has happened. Furniture and toys is another sector where growth has happened. You don't really see low-end services is clearly been one area where employment growth has been happening. Construction is one area where employment growth happened in the earlier years. But overall, no major employment growth in sectors where wages can grow. So that is, I guess, the reason for the stagnation. Yes, I think the point that Hari made is very important. We should try look at the consumption expenditure data to get more details. I did work with the 2011-12 consumption expenditure data. One finding was that the consumer durables, the proportion of the top 10% consume around 50% of the entire consumer durables, consumed in India. So there is high degree of inequality in consumption in the country. Definitely one can look at the latest data. The other set of questions were about the periodization. I think Bhaskar was also mentioning the 2004 to 12 was a period of fast growth, high investment. But it's also a period when I believe we did not really benefit in the manufacturing sector to the fullest extent. And some of the problems, the discussions were mentioning about the rise of the bigger advantages for some other sectors like the IT sector. So land became much costlier. Sectors like IT can pay much higher wages, can pay much higher amounts for land. So manufacturing became much more, this increased the cost of manufacturing. So, I mean, if you look at our engineering colleges, much of the engineers do not want to enter manufacturing, they want to enter services or the finance industry. So, which is very, and I think there were also kind of policy mistakes in that period, 2004 to 12, while the economy overall was booming, there was no clear focus on manufacturing. If you look at the exchange rate policy, the exchange rate was, huge amount of fluctuations in exchange rate. Very unlike the case of China during that time when it's during its period of fast growth of manufacturing, when exchange rate management was tailored for the growth of manufacturing. None of that happened in India. And trade policies, many of you mentioned, very quick reduction of tariffs in many sectors has affected Indian industry, and so on and so forth. So, whereas the period from 2012 to 19, just before demonetization, was a period of slowing investment, which means slowing formal sector, but a period of also particularly difficult time for the unorganized sector. GST and demonetization, we all know. Now, what about the unorganized sector? When we say 60 million, a large part of it in small unregistered enterprises, we must understand that at least a small part of that, quite a large number of these unregistered enterprises are probably going to, they're very household enterprises, extremely low productivity. And over time, what one expects is some of the extremely poor productivity enterprises might die, but some of the others should be able to move up from the unorganized to the organized. So in a way, the macroeconomic environment should be able to kind of uplift the potential, those enterprises among the unregistered which have the potential, they should be able to move up the value added and perhaps join the unregistered sector. So in a way, some of the policies like the GST is, the objective is to transform the unorganized to the organized. But are there enough support policies for the unorganized? No. If you like, we just saw the credit issue. The import is the rising import intensity of Indian manufacturing is very, very, very critical factor. I remember visiting the BHEL factory in Trichy. So, typically BHEL, being a public sector, it has a small, over the years, there's an industrial estate around it. And, it encouraged the small industries to grow in its vicinity. But, I was told that, with the power industry, in later years, when import intensity increased, you import the entire equipment, which means the growth opportunities for the small scale is going down. The other questions, I guess, yes, thanks Sangeeta for your point about discrimination in the labor market. Some new studies, I shall certainly look into it. And I think lastly, the point that was made, region-wise industrial policy is important, because I remember one comment came, one of the migrant workers we met in Ludhiana is that, these are workers coming from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. So the worker was saying, we come from Uttar Pradesh, but there is a lot of land. Why is the industry not in Uttar Pradesh? And in fact, I think that's a very valid question. When the garment industry was initially established in Ludhiana had certain advantages of land, labor, and so on. But now, probably other regions have those advantages, where the labor. So, in fact, the industry should be able to move to, at least to some extent, where there is more labor, which means there should be state-specific industrial policies. So, labor surplus, regions where there is labor, they should be able to establish labor-intensive industries. Whereas a region like Tamil Nadu or perhaps Kerala, it's high time that these regions have to move up the ladder and move into probably more technology-intensive or knowledge-intensive industries, which also require some degree of state intervention. So I hope the planning board under Vijay Bhaskar will do something in that regard. I will end here.
Thank you, Professor Jain. And now the floor is open now. We can expect some comments and feedback on your presentation. But in the meanwhile, there are some comments on your presentation in the chat box. You can go through and respond accordingly. You just go through the chart. I think there are 2-3 comments. I think you can
There's
respond
one
to
about
them.
automation and employment generation.
Yeah. And another one is
Should I
something
read them
like,
out? Jayan, have you found them?
Yeah, I saw that. I can see the lot of questions. Am I audible? Yeah.
question. You can just pull them together, then respond in
Yeah,
one shot.
I can see that there are questions on AI, manufacturing, automation. I guess yes. In a way, I think automation means clearly that the new employment generation is going to slow down in manufacturing, which is going to be a big challenge for us, which is going to be a big challenge for India. Because the labor absorption that happened in manufacturing in China of the 80s and 90s will not happen in India now. But on the other, in fact, at the same time, we must also mention, like I said, the period of fast growth of labor supply in India is now. Between around 2000 to 2020. And in fact, after this, we are going to see somewhat of a slowdown. Like post 2030, we're going to see a slowdown in the growth of the young population. Or in fact, there'll be in fact, you already see labor shortages in some Indian states. Like, if you go to the southern states, you already find a labor shortage. So I think all this, what it points out is there is a need to move into a new economic structure, and it doesn't have to be entirely manufacturing led. We understand nowadays there's a discussion that should India's kind of try to skip manufacturing and think only about services. Perhaps that is not right, because we need goods production. But like I said, the employment generation in manufacturing is certainly going to come down. So, which means we need to have a focus also on services. And I think what I said at the conclusion stands. What is required even for the creation of more services jobs is an upgradation of human skills. So education and health are going, public investments in education and health are going to be very, very crucial, both for the creation of a labor supply which can work in advanced manufacturing as well as in the services sector. So I think that's my response to the AI, the automation question. I don't know whether I've answered everything. If you can just let me know if there's anything I missed.
Yeah, there are others also coming up. You can just go to their Partha Sahu from NIRD PR Hyderabad. He has a comments. There is a skill narrative to your story, so something like that. You can
Yeah.
go through the chat.
Yeah, I think, yeah, skill. Well, I'm not so sure. I'm definitely, I'm sure your ISID there are more experts here on the panel and with the institute. To what extent is skill coming from education? One thing that we need to understand from the East Asian success story is that education played a very important role in industrialization in those regions. Remember, that was at that time, this is industrialization of the 60s and 70s. Probably now education might play an even bigger role today. Um, so, and I guess also when, a focus on quality and skills cannot be developed, when workers there's no security for workers. I mean, you work for a year and then you leave the firm and you're paid extremely low wages. So it's actually might be very difficult to expect in such a condition for the workers to pick up the skills and to be trained. You remember in Japan in the initial years, in the 1940s and 50s, workers were lifetime employees of firms. So, and this is what Alice Armstrong argues. The fact that East Asia could compete with the West in technologies which essentially came from the West. You didn't have an advantage in technology. These were borrowed technologies. And what you did was learning these technologies developed elsewhere. So you could do it only by doing things better. And this happened with workers playing a very big part, in terms of improving the quality. The workers were involved in quality circles, so I don't think that kind of interaction is happening now in India, especially with the informalization of the formal sector. Increasingly, that is not happening. So there is probably no incentive for skill acquisition either, for the no opportunity for skill acquisition. Yes, I guess MSMEs should be able to play a very big role in India. I should just say that MSMEs should be strengthened. I mean, there's no reason that MSMEs remain as MSMEs or micro enterprise remain as micro enterprise. So there should be a situation where the micro enterprise is able to move up the ladder to become a small or a medium enterprise. But without the protection, without some degree of state support, many of the micro enterprises are going to, instead of moving up, they probably move down, or they just, they are not able to survive. So that situation should be avoided in India. I'm not so sure if I'm anything. If there is, please.
There is one comment from Anush from IIT Bombay. Yeah, you can go through that. Completely
Anush,
agree
yes,
on state. Yeah.
Yes, Anush, thank you, Anush, for attending and state. But as you know, yeah, I think it's a very, very, very important question. How do we avoid a race to bottom competition between states? I can actually think of a garment unit in Kerala, very famous case that happened in 2022. A very well-established garment unit, in fact, a modern unit. They said that their next unit is going to be in Telangana, but that generated a lot of political discussions within Kerala that the government is not doing enough to protect the garment industry in the state. No, I think, in fact, I wrote about that. Now, one of the things to be mentioned was that this unit, while being in Kerala, it was facing a huge labor shortage within the state. Now, much of the workers were migrant workers. So at the same time, this is a unit which needed a large amount of land. Land was certainly not available in Kerala at that time, something like 1,000 acres of land. So, it's clear that, this entire discussion and this entire episode is because we do not discuss enough the state level differences in demographic structures, because you have labor shortage in some places, but you have labor surplus in some other places. So I think much of this race to the bottom can be avoided if you have greater planning. If you have greater planning at the national level and greater planning at the state level. A state like Kerala or Tamil Nadu should realize that it is, they are not going to able to, in the coming years, they will have very little chances in labor intensive industries. So, they shouldn't be really trying in labor intensive industries. So they should actually be trying. In fact, that's what happened in East Asia. Once wages went up, a Singapore or a Malaysia, some of the high wage countries, they actually moved up the value chain, or Taiwan, for instance. They were, I think a similar kind of planning should happen in India between states, and that can be done with greater coordination and planning between the center and the states. And of course, one constraint to that is that most Indian states do not have the fiscal resources to do it, or the fiscal autonomy to do this, because much of the funds required this, to start a new industry or to start a new research institution are very big, and I'm sure Bhaskar will be able to say more on this, which states do not have. So in fact, that is another reason why this race to the bottom, which means that, they have to be desperate. They have to be desperate to whatever investments come through. They do not have a choice. States do not have a choice. So that kind of a situation should not happen. Sorry.
We have a hand raised, Manoj Begaonkar.
Yeah,
please go ahead.
Thank you. So really very interesting discussion for me. I come from industry and part of a regulatory work. So over a period of time, also the time what was mentioned in the study, we have seen a servitization of manufacturing actually. And so many of the big companies, they have started outsourcing it. And that's where manufacturing actually became a service and not a mainline manufacturing part of it. So that was one part of it. Second part also, because of which I think a lot of vendor development initiatives which the bigger companies should do. For example, just to take an example, the largest automotive company can take it with their suppliers and they in turn with their suppliers, because all these are MSMEs ultimately. But you need to also look at it beyond the cost, because the entire relationship across these supply chains are purely based on cost. And that's why the keeping the wages artificially low and the whole thing starts, because otherwise they are always feared that someone else will take over my job, my role, and then I have a challenge. So these are some of the things which I have seen as an outsider to this. So what do you think about these topics? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Manoj. Thank you for those insights from the industry, and I fully agree with this. This service, increasing, growing importance of the services sector, which part of it is unavoidable. But at the same time, how can manufacturing, able to maintain its? How can manufacturing continue to attract labor, for instance, attract talent, attract engineers? I think these are going to be the crucial questions in the coming years.
But how do we get data from service into this? Because though it is a manufacturing service, it still goes into service sector. And so manufacturing always remains the same. So I'm not sure. For example, after sales service, it's a technical job, but you do it as a service contract and it is classified under service. revenue, but not shown under manufacturing actually, because it's related to manufacturing part.
Yeah. Yes, I fully agree with this. Yeah.
Thank you for the comment. I think we are almost 5 o'clock. We are almost at 5 o'clock. I don't think there is any comment through chat box and something. So I think it is time to wind up the seminar. So I don't think it is no more comments are coming up. We indeed had a very enriched discussion this afternoon. So thank you so much, Professor Joyan Thomas. And thank you all the distinguished panelists. They have also added to your discussion. They also that made the thing more enriched. So thank you all for this for joining us. Hope to catch you up later in future. Bye.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you,
Jayan.
Jayan.
Thank
Thanks,
you. Yeah.
Habib.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
all.
Thank
Thank you
Bye.
for the
Thank
discussion.
you. Thank you.
I hope I can just copy this, if you don't mind. 1 minute, I can. Okay. I'll just copy the comments.
We will share you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that'll be.